African history Sudan 1855–1914. Sudan 1855–1914. Sudan, like Egypt, was under foreign rule since the 1820s when the Turks ruled Egypt and established a Turco-Egyptian government over Sudan during the days of Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt Albanian. The regime in Sudan between 1820 and 1881 has been referred to as the Turco-Egyptian regime. To many historians, this rule has been regarded as exploitative, oppressive, and full of armed conflict and resistance. However, this is a one-sided view. Turco-Egyptian rule in Sudan 1820–1885. During this period, the Sudanese provinces were divided into districts that were further divided into smaller units. The Turco-Egyptian administration was maintained by a large army recruited from the Negroes and Arabs of Sudan. Muhammad Ali's conquest of Sudan had a great impact on social, economic, and political development of the country. Socially, slave trade was made illegal and the constant jihad movements waged on southerners by Arabs from the north came to an end. Economically, there was an increase in trade between Sudan and Egypt. New crops were introduced and cotton growing was started on a substantial scale. A lot of land was brought under irrigation scheme that led to the establishment of large cotton and sugarcane plantations in Sudan. Communication was improved and a telegraph system linking Cadi Haifa to Upper Egypt was set up. The foundation of Khartoum as a capital city of modern Sudan was established. The main bank of Sudan and a modern monetary system was established in Sudan by Turco-Egypt and administrated to make easier the imposition and collection of taxes from Sudanese. Politically, the Turco-Egyptian administration expanded to the area of their authority by conquering the pagan Negro tribes of south and bringing them under the same government with Muslims of the north. This administration employed European experts in an effort to modernize the country just as the same developments had taken place in Egypt. E.g., Samuel Baker was one of the Blue Nile and confirmed that White Nile had its origin further in the south. These Europeans also encouraged the spread of Christianity in southern Sudan where the inhabitants were completely pagans. This regime employed the German administration arm in Pasha who moved as far as northern Uganda with a number of Sudanese and European soldiers. However, despite all the above developments, the Turco-Egyptian rule was largely unpopular in Sudan. This was largely because of their repressive policies, resource exploitation, non-representation of Sudanese in Turco-Egyptian government, corrupt administrators, lack of able leaders, degeneration of Islamic religion, disunity among the local people, etc., all of which culminated into the Mahdist uprising of 1881–1885. African history Sudan 1855–1914. The Mahdi mobilized people along religious grievances, but the revolt didn't only get support from the Muslims. It was supported countrywide as the Turco-Egyptians' outcry spread to all regions of Sudan. The fact that the Mahdist revolt mobilized all the Sudanese including North Sudanese Muslims, southern people, civil workers, commoners and the army shows that there were many other causes of the revolt than religion. The revolt was a nationalistic one under the cover of religion. Causes of the revolt. These related around social, political and economic injustices subjected to the Sudanese by foreigners. Social causes. Anti-foreign cultures. Socially, the Sudanese were oppressed to Egyptian religious leaders, teachers, and their leaders. The newcomers did not respect the Sudanese culture that increased resentment against the foreign rule by the Sudanese masses. The Turco-Egyptians employed many young Europeans who were Christians. This increased the European Christian interference in the affairs of Sudan. The Christians didn't have any respect for Sudanese Islamic religion and they were considered as infidels, non-believers. It is said they were corrupt, open wine drinkers, luxurious and arrogant, all of that resulted into the Mahdist revolt. Religious discontent related to the above, the distinction between religious beliefs of foreigners and the Sudanese creative religious resentment against the Turco-Egyptian government. These were sentiments that enable Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdi attracts enough followers against the Turco-Egyptian government. Nevertheless, Mahdist uprising has support from all the Christians, all Muslims and pagans of Sudan plus other classes of people irrespective of their religious differences, which confirms that Mahdist revolt was quite nationalistic and only religious-oriented. The desire to Sudanize their administration led to the emergence of Mahdist revolt in 1881. The Turco-Egyptian administration was corrupt and inefficient and therefore did little to cater for the needs of the Sudanese. The educated Sudanese were not given jobs except those of lowest grades or of degrading nature, e.g., receptionists, clerks, secretaries, etc. Emergence of Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdi. By 1881 all causes of the revolt were ripe and the weakness in Egypt at that time provided an opportune moment for the rise of the Mahdi. His determination and ability mobilized the Sudanese against the Turco-Egyptian government and was a vital factor for success of the Mahdist revolt. He exploited a desperate situation in Egypt to spearhead a revolution in Sudan that overthrew the Turco-Egyptian government in 1885. Among the political causes was the loss of independence. For a period of 60 years Sudanese were tied to the African history Sudan 1855–1914. Charges at this time were aimed at clearing off their debts from Egyptian economy. These events preoccupied the Egyptians and diverted their attentions from Sudan. At the same time were aimed at clearing off their debts from Egyptian economy. These events preoccupied the Egyptians and diverted their attentions from Sudan. At the same time, the crushing of Eurobeast overshadowed the Egyptian superiority, which encouraged the Mahdist revolt to rise up against the Turco-Egyptian administrators. The local administrators sent to Sudan from Egypt also tried as much as possible to benefit on their assignments by exploiting the country. This was partly because they were not sure of their posts, since transfers or dismissals were very common in Turco-Egyptian government. To benefit therefore, each of them would try to exploit the area under his jurisdiction as much as possible. Political repressive system. The other nature of their administration was its repressiveness. Between 1820–1880, the Turco-Egyptian government had tried to maintain a large army up to 10,000 infantry recruited from the Sudanese Negroes and about 900 in cavalry. These were for defending the Turco-Egyptian interests and machinery for repression against internal opposition. Head of Ismail used this force to implement his policies, e.g. forced tax collection, forced Sudanese recruitment, etc. Economically, land alienation led to the revolt. Muhammad Ali and all his successors maintained the exploitation of Sudan. At least they all had a record of grabbing land from Sudanese for developing cotton growing schemes on a large scale, which caused discontent to Sudanese. These problems of land alienation contributed to the Mahdist uprising. Forced labor. The Sudanese were also forced to work in cotton plantations, roads, and other public works. They were forced to transport cotton and timber for long distances. The Sudanese were forced to grow cotton, which was taken by Turco-Egyptian administrators at very low prices, and were forced to buy Egyptian goods, some of which were very expensive. This form of economic imperialism was responsible for the outbreak of Mahdist revolt. Unfair taxation. The successors of Muhammad Ali, and particularly Ismail, tried to generate the revenue from Sudan in order to solve the financial difficulties at home. When the Egyptian treasury became bankrupt, the Turco-Egyptian government decided to overtax the Sudanese in order to meet the ever-increasing debts incurred by Ismail from European bankers. The methods of tax collection were equally brutal, because failure to pay a tax meant confiscation of individuals' properties and sometimes mutilation of their body parts. The abolition of slave. Formerly slaves used to be the main trading item, but with the coming of Turco-Egyptian administrations in Sudan, slavery was abolished and ivory became a monopoly of Turco-Egyptian administrators. African history. Sudan 1855–1914. In October, Britain sent a relief expedition under Colonel Stewart, who unfortunately arrived too late. On 25th January 1885, he and his men reached Khartoum only to find that Gordon and his officers had been murdered 2 days earlier, and the city had fallen to the forces of the Mahdi. Muhammad Ahmed became the political and religious leader in Sudan in 1885 after the defeat of the Turco-Egyptian rule. Unfortunately, he didn't live long to enjoy the fruits of his success. He died in 22nd June 1885 after a period of 3 months' rule. During his short rule, he enjoyed respect and popularity in the whole of Sudan. He tried to create a strong government built on Islamic ideas. He also reorganized the system of taxation and improved on the methods of tax collection. He reformed the system of justice based on Islamic laws. His main aim was to reform Islam in Sudan. He punished corruption, inefficiency, drunkenness, theft, and adultery. Indeed, Muhammad Ali tried to implement the ideas of his struggle religiously, although his administration had a sound political impact in the Sudanese. When he died, Sudan had already re-established her independence with a strong judicial system and an organized economy. It was this state of administration that he left in the hands of 3 caliphs, i.e. Abdullah, Ali, and Muhammad. Abdullah became superior to the other 2 and succeeded at the throne. His regime was full of internal and external problems, which finally led to the collapse of the Mahdist state in 1898. Reasons for the success of the Mahdist revolt. Able leadership. The cross-section of local populace welcomed Muhammad Ahmed. The Mahdi is a natural concept among Muslims to believe in people of their religion. He was a preacher and raised hopes of Sudanese by promising political, economic, and social reforms. His words fell on fertile brains as people were discontented of the Turco-Egyptian rule. He attracted support in almost all Sudanese major tribes, such as the Bakar cattle keepers, the Southern Kordofan and Darfini tribes. Section of propaganda literature. Muhammad Ahmed and his group used convincing words that naturally united the Sudanese behind a common cause. For example, they seriously condemned the unfair taxation policies, corruption, recruitment of Sudanese into the Egyptian forces, forced labor, and inefficient Turco-Egyptian administration. With such words, all classes of people in Sudan had to support the revolt, hence its success. The geographical extent of the revolt. It was as widespread as the Turco-Egyptian rule in Sudan. The grievances for the revolt could be easily found. African history. Sudan 1855–1914. Impact of financial bankruptcy in Egypt. Khedive Ismail had borrowed a lot of money from European banks, especially France and Britain, and by 1879, the interest on borrowed amount has accumulated. By 1881, at the outbreak of Mahdist revolt, Egypt was still servicing the foreign debt, which even increased pressure from European Economic Commission. Thus it was in a weak financial position to finance a war at this scale. Organising and sending of regular expeditions to Sudan became hard, hence leading to the success of the Mahdist revolt. Lack of foreign assistance. The British government was quite reluctant to help the Egyptian government against the Sudanese, and Egypt couldn't appeal to Ethiopia for military assistance because of their historical conflicts. The British Prime Minister supported the principle of self-government by the Sudanese. Under such circumstances, it became too costly in terms of money and manpower to defeat the Mahdist revolt. Role of Islam as a unifying factor. The Sudanese people used Islam as a tool of resistance. Regardless of the distinction in their beliefs, it was Islam which gave people strength, morale, courage, determination, and the sense of unity. The presence of common grievances and objectives of the rebellion made all the Sudanese to rally behind their Muslim leader, Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdi. The unique environment in Sudan. The weakness of the Egyptian side coupled with the hostile environment in Sudan made the Mahdist revolt a success. The geography of the two countries was not exactly the same. The infrastructural setting was different, all of which provided an advantage to the Mahdist side. On top of this, war suppliers in terms of arms, foods, and drinks were in short supply. There was lack of proper guidance from the local population, thus leading to Egyptian defeat. The Mahdist forces had military advantage over Turco-Egyptian army. They were well prepared, large in numbers, and under the effective commander of generals like Abdullah. The Mahdist forces devised several military expeditions that the Turco-Egyptian forces failed to cope with. They managed to push the British forces led by Hicks deep into waterless scrubland of southern Sudan. The morale of the local people. Those who never went for war kept home praying and singing praising songs of success at the war front, such as, "It is hopeless to fight the soldiers of Allah." The elders kept encouraging the young adult to enroll into the forces of Mahdist and liberate their country from the hands of the Turco-Egyptian administrators. The Mahdist. African history, Sudan 1855-1914. The demands of the escalating debt. The local people were overtaxed, soldiers' privileges reduced, all of which demoralized the Turco-Egyptian forces. The coming in of his son as a new king of Egypt in 1879 worsened the situation. Causes of the Mahdist revolt. The Mahdist revolt was a struggle carried out by the Sudanese against foreign Turco-Egyptian rule. Some of the causes were political, religious, or economic. Politically, the Turco-Egyptian regime was characterized by considerable oppression and mismanagement/government. Many of the local administrators were engaged in corrupt and oppression were chronic features of the Turco-Egyptian rule. It was because of the maladministration and malpractices of the Turco-Egyptians that the Sudanese revolted. It was worthy nothing that with the employment of European Christians in important positions such as Gordon and Baker, there arose a belief that the country was going to be handed over to the Europeans. The situation was worsened by Gordon when, as Governor-General, he took an active part in opposing slave trade. The steps he took to punish slave traders disturbed the traditional economy of the Sudan and aroused bitter opposition. The fact that he employed increasing numbers of Europeans in administrative posts under him increased the bitterness. With all this taking place, a spirit of nationalism among the Sudanese rose. They therefore revolted. The Mahdist revolt was also an attack on foreigners as a way of regaining lost sovereignty. Ever since the Sudan was conquered in 1820 by Muhammad Ali, the local people had regarded the established regime as alien and a sign of loss of social, political, and economic independence. Thus the Sudanese revolted to achieve self-determination. To crown it all, whatever sign of discontent that was shown by the Sudanese was suppressed with torture. The local Sudanese suffered so much that they all supported Muhammad Ahmed in revolt against the tortures. Religiously, a problem existed. The Turkish administrators belonged to the Hanafite school of Muslim law, the most lax of all the Islamic codes. Many of the Turkish administrators were open wine drinkers, adulterers, and heavy smokers. These practices were particularly shocking to the Sudanese who belonged to the strict Malikite horizon, a form of jihad that was geared towards the purification of the faith. It must be emphasized here that this was the main objective of their leader Muhammad Ahmed and his true supporters, the Ashraf. To attain religious purity, however, it was important that very political system responsible for disrespect for Islam is attacked and changed. Coupled with the religious laxity, the religious feelings of the Sudanese were also disturbed by the employment of European Christians who were considered as infidels and not worthy governing them. In the 19th century, Sudan was a free Islamic area, and this brought about a tendency towards fanaticism, which encouraged more resentment against the non-Muslims. The religious concern of the Sudanese Muslims had been motivated by the successive jihads of the early 19th century in West Africa. The economic, social, and political misery which the Sudanese was subjected to was seen by the devoted Muslims as a consequence of the moral degeneration, hence the revolt. Economically, the Sudanese were subjected to much economic exploitation. The Sudanese were heavily taxed. The inequitable system of taxation and the barbarous methods adopted in its collection had become an unbearable burden. Additionally, earlier attempts by Khedive Ismail and his foreign administrators to suppress slave trade struck at an important source of wealth to the Sudanese economy, and therefore stopping it meant masterminding its underdevelopment. There was also forced labor on cotton plantations and on the building. African history Sudan 1855-1914 of canals, dams and roads. Land grabbing from the Sudanese was also resented. Thus the Sudanese decided to strike at the Turco-Egyptians as quick means of getting rid of the massive economic exploitation. Another cause of the modest revolt has been associated with the philosophies of its leader Mohammed Ahmed. His philosophies provided the immediate motivation for revolt. In June 1881, he dispatched letters to all notable Sudanese. In the letter, he stated that he was the expected Mahdi, that is, divine ruler sent by God to restore Islam and do away with Islam's impurity and corruption. Partly because of this and largely because of his initiative, Mohammed Ahmed was able to provide leadership which attracted and united a large body of followers into staging a successful revolution against Turco-Egyptian rule. Other scholars have linked the outbreak of the Sudanese rebellion to the resignation of Charles George Gordon as Governor-General of Sudan when Khedive Ismail of Egypt was deposed in 1879. Gordon was not an ideal ruler. He was an oppressive and unpopular Christian ruler to the Sudanese. Thus, his resignation following the overthrow of Khedive Ismail has been interpreted as having left behind an ideal situation for the Mahdists to exploit their advantage. This was particularly so because Gordon's successor Mohammed Rauf was too weak to effectively maintain the tone and trend of administration that the forceful Gordon had set in motion. For example, even after he had realized that the Mahdists were intriguing for rebellion, Rauf failed to suppress it in time. The Mahdists therefore got ample time to continue organizing themselves. By the time government tried to suppress them, it was too late. The Mahdists had already established themselves and the revolt was inevitable. The responsibility for the outbreak of the revolt can also be traced from what was transpiring in Egypt itself. Clearly, the reign of Khedive Ismail Pasha had ended in 1879 when he was deposed and replaced by his son, Tewfik. If Ismail was a weak ruler, then Tewfik proved to be even a weaker choice. He was a puppet of the great powers. The change of rulers, particularly in this, had removed the prestige which had surrounded the dynasty from the time of Muhammad Ali. In Egypt, the forces of opposition gathered around the army leader, Urabi Pasha, who effected a revolution in the center of power. The revolutionary changes made metropolitan control over the Sudanese province lukewarm. The Mahdi found its opportunity in the power control over the Sudanese vacuum created by the disappearance of Ismail's autocracy. When the power vacuum was promptly followed by Gordon's resignation, the Sudan was faced with a pretty good situation for revolt. The Turco-Egyptian conquest of Sudan. Sudan was invaded in 1820 by the army of Muhammad Ali under the command of his third son Kamel Pasha. Kamel used 9 multiracial army of Egypt, Iberians and Bedouin Arabs. The Sultanate was a weak state to conquer. Kamel's troops in the Egyptian conquest met with little resistance except from the Shaikh ethnic group. There was a brief rising in 1822 in which Kamel lost his life. After the rising had been silenced, the Egyptian colonial capital was established in 1824 at Khartoum, and Sudan remained under Turco-Egyptian rule till the Mahdist rebellion of 1881-5. The reasons for Muhammad Ali's conquest were serious. Muhammad wanted to create and expand the Egyptian empire. He also wished to have access to the gold mines he believed were in Sudan, to obtain the Negro slaves to incorporate into his army, to obtain timber, to revitalize trade between Sudan and Egypt, to punish Mamluks who had established themselves in northern Sudan, and to exploit Sudan so as to solve the poverty in Egypt. Ali also claimed that he wanted to liberate the Sudanese from incessant civil wars, which characterized the Funge administration. African history Sudan 1855-1914. Turco-Egyptian rule in Sudan has been generally described as oppressive and exploitative. It has been pointed out that Muhammad Ali conquered the Sudan less to develop it than to exploit it. True, the Turco-Egyptian rule had negative impacts on the Sudan. Nevertheless, some of the consequences were positive. Among the results was the urbanization of the Sudan. In 1824, Khartoum was a mere village near the junction of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. But by 1833, it had expanded into an administrative capital of the country. Other towns that expanded included Omdurman and Port Sudan. There was also an improvement in transport and communication systems. A telegraph system was established which by 1866 linked Wad Taffa and Upper Egypt. In 1874, this was extended to Khartoum. Another telegraph line was built linking Sudan to the Red Sea, and another extended westward through El Obi to the borders of Darfur. Additionally, in Khedive Ismail's regime, a system of river steamers was developed on the Nile and a shipyard built at Khartoum. The government also financed service steamers on the Red Sea coast. The postal service was also taken over by the government and improved. Besides, there was increased flow of trade between Egypt and the Sudan. Though most benefits of the trade went to the Egyptians, there is little doubt that it was the Turco-Egyptian era which promoted Sudan to the international trade in the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, the Sudanese experienced an era of a cash economy. Even Egyptian currency was introduced and became operational in Sudan. Also, the interior of Sudan was open to the outside world. Indeed, some of the Arabic-speaking groups living in the Nile Valley became quite prosperous through their involvement in the considerable shipping traffic that developed on the river. Others became even wealthier by partaking in the slave and ivory trades in the southern Sudan. The nomadic tribes supplied camels and other domestic animals, which after slaves and ivory formed the main exports of the Sudan. Another impact had to do with the development of agriculture. Egyptian administrators and expatiators were sent to Sudan to teach the Sudanese new farming techniques. They even introduced and established cotton, sugar, and indigo plantations. New lands were brought under irrigation and cultivation done on them. Thus the Turco-Egyptian administration of foreign and the Sudan was not totally destructive. The Turco-Egyptian regime in the Sudan also effected a certain increase of political development by uniting under one government many different ethnic communities and political units. Under Muhammad Ali's government, a larger political unit than had hitherto existed at the time a French Sultanate was created in the area. Thus, for the first time, the pagan Negroes of the south and the Muslims of the north were ruled under one government. It has to be noted that although this led to the unification, it also sowed seeds for the future South-North conflict. African history Sudan 1855-1914. He was born in 1844 in Dongola province to a family of boat builders. As a young man, Ahmed received education in Islamic law and theology at the feet of a famous learned man Sheikh Taib. He was an eager scholar and soon became a faqih, that is, a man learned in Islamic law. He became a powerful member of the Samaniya Brotherhood. At the age of 17 years, Muhammad was already an eloquent preacher. As a result, many converts converged around him and they were to become his powerful force in his mission of creating an ideal Islamic society. Like other contemporary Islamic religious reformers, Muhammad Ahmed dreamt of a return to the ideal Islamic government that was believed to have existed in the days of the first four Muslim caliphs. He hoped to see the whole Islamic world reunited under a righteous ruler who would strictly govern it in accordance with the sacred teachings of the Quran. Muhammad preached against the luxury and corruption of the times and called for a return to the purity and spiritual state of an ideal Islamic life. He saw the Turks as ungodly and corrupt. He condemned the Sudanese sheikhs for their lax and luxurious way of life and their acceptance of offices under the Turco-Egyptian regime. He began to see himself as the heaven-sent deliverer destined to rule the entire Muslim community and restore it to godliness and purity. In 1881, his followers proclaimed him as the Mahdi, the Guided One. Due to his relentless attack on the social, political, and economic conditions that were affecting the Sudanese under the unjust Turco-Egyptian rule, Muhammad won a big number of masses who rallied behind him. When he strongly attacked the ungodly nature and lax life, he attracted a band of fanatic Muslims. The non-Muslims also won due to the relevancy of Mahdi's message. There were the Jalian and the Danikal boatmen and traders who joined the Mahdi not out of Islamic zeal but because of the heavy taxation and abolition of slave trade from which they had greatly benefited. The Bakkara nomads also joined because they complained of heavy taxation. All these groups saw in the Mahdi a man who would champion their causes and lead the redemption from the agonies of the Turco-Egyptians. Course and events of the Mahdist Revolt. The Mahdist Revolt broke out in June 1881 when Muhammad Ahmed dispatched from the Aba Islands on the White Nile letters to several Sudanese notables. In the letters, he claimed that he was the Mahdi chosen and sent by God to bring about justice and equality to the world then filled with oppression and misdeeds. With a political crisis in Egypt, the urgent conditions in Turco-Egyptian Sudan, and his own religious piety, Muhammad was able to win massive support of the followers/helpers during the revolt known as the Ansar. Among the Ansar were those people attracted by Muhammad's claim that he was the Mahdi sent by God to renew Islamic faith, cleanse Islam of its faults, and restore Islamic ideas. Another group comprised of people who had been economically threatened by the Turco-Egyptian attempt to abolish slave trade in the Sudan. The most affected were the northern tribes, the Jalian and the Danikala. These were neither theologians nor devoted Muslims, but used the religious umbrella as a vehicle to achieve their political and economic interests. Thus, under the banner of religion, these merchants united behind the Mahdi in the hope of recapturing their old position as slave traders. The third group comprised of the cattle-keeping nomads of Kordofan and Darfur. The Bakkara nomads disliked political control by any settled government. They were also unhappy with the paying of high taxes to the Turco-Egyptian administration. When the Mahdi appeared, these Bakkara interpreted him as a sign of hope towards tax reform. African history Sudan 1855-1914. With the massive support and the proclamation of Muhammad Ahmed as the Mahdi, the Turco-Egyptian government was alarmed, and so he was summoned to Khartoum. He defied the summons, and in retaliation an expedition was sent against him, which he defeated. This first defeat of the Turco-Egyptian forces was a blessing to the Mahdists. The victory news spread rapidly among the masses that Allah had fought on the side of the Mahdi, and that the Mahdi had defeated the enemies without much military effort, but with only stones and clubs against guns. With the news, support for the Mahdi grows rapidly. Soon the support had to overwhelm the Turco-Egyptian forces. Muhammad Ahmed conducted his campaign according to Islamic ideals modelled on the life of Prophet Muhammad. He began by performing a hijra, that is a holy flight from the ungodly, a flight that was akin to Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina. The hijra took the Mahdi to Kordofan in the west, where most of his supporters were to be found. In Kordofan and neighbouring Darfur, the Mahdi won several military successes and then began to extend his power eastward. By 1883, he was not only ruling over Kordofan and Darfur, but was also a master of the areas around the Blue Nile. Osman Digna governed the eastern parts on behalf of the Mahdi. At that time, the Turco-Egyptian administration was in a particularly weak position following the British occupation of Egypt in 1882. Thus, in 1883, the British decided to support their puppet regime in Egypt in a bid to restore Turco-Egyptian army to capture the Mahdi in Kordofan. Hicks' expedition was decisively defeated, and the Sudanese interpreted the victory as another miracle and sign that Ahmed was really the Mahdi. Consequently, many Sudanese hesitated no more to rally behind the Mahdi. In 1883, an official decision was taken by the British government to evacuate the Sudan and leave it to the Mahdi. Thus, General Charles George Gordon, ex-governor of the Equatorial Province, was dispatched by the British government to Khartoum in order to evacuate the Egyptian soldiers and administrators, as the Mahdists were apparently gaining an upper hand over the Egyptians. Gordon arrived in February 1884 and quickly realized that a peaceful evacuation wasn't possible. Gordon then blundered by defying the orders given to him and decided to smash the Mahdi. Gordon's forces were far too small for the advancing massive following of Muhammad Ahmed, and he found himself cut off and besieged in Khartoum. On January 25, 1885, Khartoum fell to the Mahdists, and by the end of the fighting, Gordon was dead. The relief expedition that had been reluctantly sent by Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, under General Watley, arrived 2 days after the death of Gordon. Unprepared to push on, the expedition just retreated, leaving the Mahdi in full control over a greater part of the former Turco-Egyptian Sudan. The Mahdi then sent himself the task of establishing his theocratic state. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ahmed did not live on to enjoy the fruits of his victory. He died 6 months later in June 1885, possibly of typhus. Before he died, the Mahdi established his capital at Omdurman. In his short reign, he managed to achieve his aims of purifying Islam and eradicating the Turco-Egyptian administrators after 65 years' reign since Muhammad Ali conquered the Sudan. He administered the Sudan basin on the Islamic Sharia law. He collected only taxes that were laid down in the Quran, and the barbaric means of taxes collection were no more. The Mahdi also tried to purify society and administered severe punishments for theft, adultery, drunkenness, smoking, and the bringing of false accusations. He succeeded in enforcing the law requiring women to wear veils. Besides, during his reign, he minted silver and gold coins. He appointed 3 deputies or caliphs to help him in his campaigns, that is Abdullahi, Ali, and Muhammad Sharif. After his death, Abdullahi succeeded him to the supreme position in African history, Sudan 1855-1914. Collected only taxes as laid down in the Quran. He also purified society by administering several punishments on theft, adultery, drunkenness, and smoking, and on the bringing of false accusations. He also successfully enforced the law of women wearing veils. Another effect of the war is that a firm foundation for future Sudanese nationalism was laid. Indeed, many scholars argue that Muhammad Ahmed is the father of modern Sudanese nationalism. This is based on the fact that although the Sudanese rose in the Mahdist revolt for social, political, and economic injustices, the idea of nationalism geared at regaining lost sovereignty was strong. Moreover, the government that was established after had some results that were a pure indication of Sudanese nationalism. The Mahdist revolt also led to massive destruction of life and property. The several Turco-Egyptian expeditions and later British expeditions that were sent against the Mahdi were defeated with several human losses. Indeed, some striking personalities such as Charles Gordon were a casualty of the struggle. Additionally, the revolt triggered off increased British interest in the reconquest of the Sudan. The death of Charles George Gordon in 1885 in the hands of the jihadists provided the British with a good excuse for the later colonization of the Sudan in 1898. The British argued that they wanted to avenge the death of Charles Gordon. The rebellion also ended with direct European involvement in the administration of Sudan. Under the Turco-Egyptians, and especially in the reign of Khedive Ismail Pasha, Europeans like Emin Pasha, Samuel Baker, and Gordon were instrumental in the administration of Sudan. However, the anti-European campaign that climaxed in the death of Charles Gordon on 1885 meant that direct European control of the Sudan had to be stopped. Heavy taxation and the brutal means of its tax collection that had characterized the Turco-Egyptian rule in the Sudan came to a halt. The Mahdi collected the taxes that were chronically prescribed. Even when taxes were imposed in the reign of Caliph Abdullahi, at least the Sudanese had enjoyed a pleasant tax break. With their success in Sudan, the Mahdists now wanted to extend the Islamic principles and ideas to neighbouring Christian Ethiopia, more so in the reign of Caliph Abdullahi. Indeed, the ideas to neighbouring Christian Ethiopia, more so, Mahdists even declared war over Ethiopia, which ended the death of Emperor John Roman IV in 1889 at the Battle of Metma. The bitter Sudan-Ethiopia relations continued and may explain the constant threats from Ethiopia, particularly in the reign of Menelik Roman II. How the Mahdi united the masses behind his movement. Mohammed Ahmed the Mahdi used a number of ways to win the support of the Sudanese for his movement. First, the Mahdi capitalized on the considerable Sudanese discontent with the Turco-Egyptian regime. In this African History, Sudan 1855-1914. Additionally, Mohammed Ahmed captured the support of many by declaring himself the Mahdi, that is the guided one not only for Sudan but of the whole world. Indeed, the letters he dispatched in June 1881 to the Sudanese notable, Mohammed claimed that he was the divine leader chosen by God to fill the earth with justice and equality. Many therefore followed him in his revolt, believing that he was God sent. Islam was also used to enhance the unity of most Sudanese. Islam defined most of the Sudanese as one class or territory fighting against the oppression of the Turco-Egyptians. Many Sudanese had the same cultural background and identity in Islam, and therefore were easily won over by the Mahdi for revolt. In spite of the fact that the Mahdi was a pious Muslim, he did not discriminate against the non-Muslims. It was this willingness and acceptance of people of any class, religions, and grievance in his movement that encouraged many to join. If the Mahdi had discriminated against the non-Muslims, it's possible that the other people would have not joined the revolt, or they would have supported the Turco-Egyptian. Such a phenomenon would have indeed starved the revolt of valuable supporters. The presence of a revolutionary army with people able and willing to use force to attain their objectives also aided the Mahdi to rally to the people behind his movement. Indeed, almost immediately after 1820's Muhammad Ali's conquest of the Sudan, there were revolts, also uprisings in Darfur against the new administration. In 1838 and 1878, and in Bahr el Ghazal in 1877 and 1878. The emergence of Mohammed Ahmed therefore found a population already charged with a spirit of revolt, and that way he won easy supporters. The Mahdi's earlier victories militarily were also a means through which he won more followers. For example, when the Mahdi proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the Egyptian government dispatched an expedition against him, which he defeated his enemies without military effort. Support for him grew rapidly. This support soon became overwhelming for the government forces to contain. Later victories also had similar effects. In 1883, when a mainly Egyptian army led by an English commander, Hicks Pasha, was decisively defeated, the Sudanese interpreted the victory as another miracle and a sign that Mohammed Ahmed really was the Mahdi and no longer hesitated in rallying to his side. Caliph Abdullahi and the Mahdi state. Caliph Abdullahi was one of the soldiers who played a leading role in the Mahdist revolt. He was the overall commander of the armies and director of administration in the Mahdi's short-lived reign. He belonged to the Taisha group of the Bakara tribe. Thus, unlike Caliph Muhammad Sharif, he wasn't a kinsman of the Mahdi. After the death of Muhammad Ahmed the Mahdi in June 1885, Caliph Abdullahi became the new ruler of the Mahdi state from 1885 to 1898 on the basis of seniority over the other two caliphs. Like his predecessor, Caliph Abdullahi believed in the purification of Islam and its extension to the non-reformed lands. Caliph Abdullahi's reign has been described differently by different historians. Some European writers describe his reign as one of the unrelieved brutality and barbarism and refer to him as a great dictator, murderer, and cruel administrator of the time. Recent research, however, shows that Abdullah's reign was a remarkably successful system. From the onset, Abdullah's reign was faced with many internal and external problems. Internally, his ethnic background as a Bakara proved a liability to him in his early years of rule. To make matters worse, members of the Mahdi's own family, the Ashraf, felt that they should hold the highest offices in the land. The Mahdi's kinsman Caliph Muhammad Sharif and his followers, the Ashraf, attempted to coup in 1886 but were defeated, disarmed, and incorporated into the forces loyal to Abdullahi. Again in 1891, the Ashraf sought the help of the African History, Sudan 1855-1914. Also during Mohammed Ahmed's short reign, he had embarked on many political and religious reforms. By virtue of his claim as the Mahdi, Mohammed Ahmed had denounced all the traditional schools of the Islamic world and prepared his own code. Those moves were naturally unpopular among the more conservative learned men and leaders of the powerful Sufi group formerly Ahmad's own in the country. These reforms were much more difficult to maintain when the Mahdi himself died. He had united the people against foreign domination, but once the hated foreign regime was gone and the Mahdi died, traditional ethnic hostilities were soon renewed. A more serious source of trouble to Caliph Abdullahi was the attempt by some of the central government control a form of seceding. Most groups felt that they had united in revolt in 1881-1885 in order to overthrow the hated Turco-Egyptians. After this, the Bakkara, Danakala and Rijalian wanted to remain independent. The Caliphate had to resort to excess use of force to silence such tendencies. Abdallah's own ethnic group, the Bakkara nomads, were among the most difficult to handle, especially those from Darfur. Although he finally settled this by forming a good number of them to leave Darfur and settle in Omdurman, this nevertheless continued to be a problem in his reign. First, the transfer of Caliph's kinsmen, the Taisha of the Bakkara, to Omdurman continued to contribute to worsening of the food crisis, for these people who had been moved to Omdurman had to be fed. Moreover, the arrival of thousands of Taisha caused considerable annoyance among the other settled supporters of the Caliphate. In foreign policy, Caliph Abdullah attempted to complete the task left by Muhammad Anid. That was the task of promoting the holy war to the Christian Ethiopian Empire and to Egypt that still had unreformed Islam on the eastern frontier lay Ethiopia. As a religious leader, the Caliphate was or thought he was duty-bound to make war against the Christian infidels, and a jihad was declared on Ethiopia. Sudanese forces invaded Ethiopia in 1889, but were severely defeated at the Battle of Midama. The Ethiopian Emperor John Roman IV was killed by a stray bullet. This even had to trigger off continued Ethiopian hostility even in the period of Menelik Roman II. There was also the Egyptian question. Although the British government had first decided on a policy of non-intervention in the Sudan, the Egyptian rulers had not abandoned hope of recovering the territory. A large section of the Egyptian army was stationed near Aswan, not far from the Sudanese northern frontier. This forced the Caliphate to maintain a large army in preparedness for an attack. In 1889, he took an initiative and invaded Egypt. After all, also Egypt had unreformed Islam. But at this moment, the Caliphate had probably bitten more than he could swallow, for the modest forces were badly defeated at Tustaki by the Anglo-Egyptian troops. By about 1892, Abdullah had failed in his foreign policy, though he had succeeded in making significant progress on the domestic front. The administrative capital was established at Omdurman. The country was then divided into provinces ruled by governors who also doubled as tax collectors. The outer provinces away from Omdurman and the surrounding area were as a solution to the internal threats to his rule, under the command of military governors who were mainly selected from the Taisha group of the Bakkara, which was the Caliphate's own ethnic group. Indeed, by the 1890s, the nature of Caliph Abdullah's reign had become too dictatorial and personal rule of sorts. He was brutal in most of his action and built an army that he used to suppress any form of opposition. The attempt to purify society in accordance with Islamic beliefs, which had been such a marked feature of the modest society policy, was continued, and a high moral tone was maintained in the administration, where corruption was severely punished. Taxes were made much lighter and more honestly collected than in the Turco-Egyptian regime, and people paid them more willingly. The Caliphate also maintained a large army which was provided by firearms, some captured from African history. Sudan 1855-1914 had to increase taxes. To make matters worse, this was the time when the Sudanese currency was debased in value due to inflation. Food shortages had set in and food prices skyrocketed. All those problems accelerated opposition against him. Noteworthy is that Abdullah's regime was marred by tribalism and nepotism. In an attempt to safeguard his position, Abdullah employed his kinsmen in the most sensitive areas of government, such as the army. This temporarily solved his internal problems, but also triggered off resentment from some groups because they had been left out. Caliph Abdullah also proved to be a very harsh ruler. His punishments for trivial cases were severe. He made matters worse by isolating himself from the rest of the people from 1892 onwards. He no longer appeared weekly at Friday prayer, and he only surfaced 4 times a year. A great wall was built around the section of Omdurman where he lived. He thus lost touch with his people and lost their support. His senior advisors were his brothers Yaqub and his eldest son Uthman. To aggravate the situation, the Caliphate continued his predecessor's policy of moving and resettling people within Sudan. This policy took different ethnic groups from one part of a country to another where such ethnic groups were not used to. Consequently, most immigrants were unproductive in their new homes and so had to be fed by the government, thereby worsening the famine situation. In spite of the weakness, however, Abdullah's rule was marked by a transformation of the modest state from a theocracy into a complex and centralized administrative unit. In the last decade of the 19th century, there were imperialist designs of several European powers interested in the Upper Nile, a problem the Caliphate had to face. The French, for instance, were interested in linking their West Africa colony Senegal and their possessions in Equatorial Africa to the Red Sea. The Germans were heading towards Caliphate state from Uganda and Kenya, the Italians from the Red Sea coast, while Menelik Roman II was from Cecil. Rhodes in South Africa, who caused to dream of linking Cairo to the Cape by a transcontinental railway and telegraph system. The Egyptians in the north were also interested in retaking the Sudan. Until 1894, the British had taken little interest in the events occurring in the Sudan. But in 1896, the French explorer Major J.B. Machen set out from the Upper Congo and reached Fashod on the Nile. Such a move by the French had been dreaded by the British since the 1882 Egyptian affair. The French were now not only going to be dangerous proximity to the Nile, but were likely to advance dangerously towards Egypt from the south. Something had to be done and done quickly. A British military expedition was therefore dispatched under Lord Kitchener. This expedition met the French expedition at Fashoda and the two almost went to war. This is what has come to be known as the Fashoda incident. France backed out and Sudan was conquered by the British under the guise that it was being done on behalf of the Khedive of Egypt Caliph. Abdullah's reign consequently came to an end, and in its place the Anglo-Egyptian condominium established the Mahdi state that had disintegrated, and it was not until 1956 that the Sudanese again regained their independence. Why the Mahdi state disintegrated? By 1898, the Mahdi state that had been founded by Muhammad Ahmed in 1885 was no more. The disintegration of this once mighty state had been a consequence of internal and external factors. Internally, the death of the Mahdi in June 1885 had left Sudan with internal division, succession struggles and civil confusion down to 1890s. The Khalifa, for instance, constantly struggled with Muhammad Ahmed's kinsmen. African history, Sudan 1855-1914. Khalifa and hence became a thorn in the back of his administration. Such internal conflict weakened the bonds of unity which the Mahdi had created, thereby making the Sudan prone to any external advance should it occur. The Mahdi state was also destined to collapse due to the very nature of the people who composed the Mahdi's revolutionary army. These composed of the Jalian, the Danikal and the Bakar nomads. After overthrowing the Turco-Egyptian administration, many of these remained either aloof or kept their original status, avoiding any hand of the administrators, refusing to pay taxes and careful to avoid the law and the long hand of justice. Consequently, these groups became a problem to the state. It can be stated therefore that the collapse of the Mahdi state was partly due to the fact that the very founders did not continue to support it through. There was lack of internal unity in the state. Thus many sections of the Sudanese were opposed to the Calipha's administration, thus undermining its existence. These included the Bakara, the Danakla, and the Ashraf. Coupled with the above is that Calipha's administration turned out to be corrupt, inefficient, and autocratic. For instance, the Caliph started off well with good and capable officers in the charge of the treasury. However, he ended up dismissing them. A striking example was Ibrahim Muhammad, an excellent administrator whom the Caliph dismissed in 1890 and replaced with less capable individuals. This also robbed the regime of valuable supporters. Also, by the late 19th century, the Sudanese army had become relatively weak due to lack of equipment and discipline. Thus, it wasn't able to stand foreign conquest, more so the more organized Anglo-Egyptian forces in 1898. The economy of the Mahdist was also weak and had virtually collapsed by the late 1890s. Agricultural output had fallen due to a combination of high taxation and bad weather. There were also high inflation and low levels of commerce. The Caliph never encouraged trade with Sudan's neighbors because of the intensive wars with Ethiopia and Egypt. All these facts meant that the economy was weak to support any meaningful projects as to make the regime popular or to find means of defense against external forces. Another factor that weakened the Mahdi state had to do with natural forces. Between 1889 and 1890, the state experienced the worst famine ever due to weather failure. Epidemics soon followed, including a locust attack that left the population badly affected. Worse still, the army that had been hard hit resorted to the countryside, looting food from the masses and torturing whoever dared to question their action, thereby eroding whatever support the Mahdi state had. Caliph Abdullah himself is partly to blame for the demise of the Mahdi state. He became too much of a jihadist than an internal Islamic reformer. In his activities, the Caliph exercised excessive power, more so in legal African history, Sudan 1855-1914. Besides, France, which was quite friendly to Sudan, was an enemy of Britain and later actually feared its presence in Sudan for various reasons. Moreover, following the French advances in the Sudan and demonstrated imperial designs of the other powers like Holy Germany and Belgium, Britain decided on the reconquest of the Sudan by completing its disintegration in 1898. Above all, this was a period of scramble and partition of Africa. As such, Sudan's integrity had to be undermined. After all, Sudan had resources and markets that were greatly demanded by Britain. The Fashoda Crisis/Incident, 1898. Fashoda Crisis was an international clash which occurred between two European imperial powers, namely Britain and France, in Africa's Sudan on the River Nile at a sand bank called Fashoda. French forces which had advanced from the Upper Congo were led by a French explorer, Major J.B. Marchand. The British forces which advanced from Egypt were under the command of Lord Kitchener. In 1898, Lord Kitchener faced Marchand at Fashoda and forced him to withdraw. This provoked the Fashoda incident, which nearly led to war between Britain and France. Indeed, it was Paris, being mindful of the British naval power in Europe, that saved the situation by ordering the withdrawal of Marchand's forces from Fashoda. Why the British and the French nearly went to war for a mere sandbank of Fashoda can be explained by a number of factors. In the first instance was the Egyptian question. In 1882, the British occupied Egypt and consequently ejected the French. But Egypt was the Nile and the Nile was Egypt. As such, Britain was interested in controlling all countries through which the Nile flowed, and determined to fight off any threats along the Nile, be it France. At the same time, the French were disappointed in losing Egypt and desired to compensate for the loss and possibly injure the interests of the British by controlling Sudan through which the Nile flowed. At the same time, in 1883, a French professor Prompts had reasoned in a lecture that the Nile would one time change its course of flow. To be secure in Egypt, it was therefore significant that they controlled the whole Nile. Hence, when the French appeared at Fashoda, they almost went to war with the British, all arising from the strategic importance of the sand bank. The British and the French almost went to war because of the economic potential of the area. Fashoda was economically significant in relation to the Nile and the Asian British Empire. It was also important in terms of communication and transport. At the same time, the Sudan was rich, or anticipated to be rich, in terms like ivory, timber, and gold. Britain was so determined to defend her economic interests along the whole Nile Valley, while the French were also interested in the same. This set the two a blink of war at Fashoda in 1898. There was also pressure from other imperial European powers scrambling for African territory. For instance, Leopold Roman II of the Congo aimed at creating a vast empire from the Congo eastward to Zanzibar, but without clearly defining its northern limits. The Germans and the Italians were also advancing towards the Nile. These advances threatened the British and the French in a rush for the Sudan, thereby triggering off the Fashoda crisis. Alongside the European imperial forces was the Ethiopian threat. Menelik Roman II had clearly indicated that he was interested in Sudan. His threat became more substantial after the Adowa victory of 1896 over the Italians. This victory had shown that Menelik had the capacity to overrun the Sudan. As such, Britain and France had to rush for the Sudan loss. It goes to Menelik. After the alliance against the British interests in the region, for France was then on good terms with Menelik XI. This possible alliance would be dangerous to the British imperial interests because, using Ethiopia and Sudan, France would antagonize British interests in Egypt, the Red Sea, and the Far East. African history, Sudan 1855-1914. Britain also had another excuse. Britain claimed the Sudan as being its property first because Gordon had died there in 1885. The argument was that the blood of a British national had been shed in Sudan, therefore Britain had the right to control the Sudan. France, on its part, wanted to link the West African and Equatorial Africa possessions to NE Africa so as to create a powerful commercial empire. Since Sudan was the missing link, it was important that if need be, force had to be applied as the only alternative for the territory to fulfill French commercial interests. Further, France at this time was trying to recover her international prestige after the 1870 defeat by Prussia. In that humiliation, France lost her iron and coal provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. At this period of the scramble and partition of Africa, when a nation's glory was measured in terms of the extent of her empire, France had to try and score victory in this field. But in her bid to do so, France ended up clashing with the British at Fashoda. Perhaps most important for France was the fact that she was threatened by the ambitious colonial program of Britain, which aimed at the creation of the Cape to Cairo Empire. Such a plan, if successful, would make Britain too powerful and France an underdog in international affairs. There was therefore that great urge to control the Sudan if Britain was to be checked. After all, if the French established themselves in the Sudan, it would be possible to revenge the 1882 British treachery when France was outdone in Egypt. However, this resulted into a clash in interests leading to the incident. It may be useful to note that Britain and France almost went to war at Fashoda in 1898 because of the encouragement given by the German Kaiser William. The Kaiser promised France that Germany would not interfere in the crisis. Moreover, Germany at the time was on bad terms with Britain after the 1895 conflict in the Jameson Raid, when the Kaiser supported the Boer against the British. It has also been suggested that the Fashoda crisis was part of a long-term Anglo-French international rivalry. France and Britain had long conflicted since the American War of Independence of 1776, the Napoleonic Egyptian Campaign of 1897, the Continental System, and so on. Thus it is possible to argue that the French and the British had old scores to settle that were just replayed at Fashoda in 1898. The Fashoda crisis did not erupt into open war. It was solved diplomatically when the French gave in to British demands and the British reciprocated. At the same time, Britain and France could not confront each other in Africa at Fashoda for fear of the consequences of war. This was because if Europeans became war-weary on the African continent, the Africans would possibly easily unite against them. Moreover, in 1885 at the Berlin Conference, European powers had agreed never to go to war over African possessions and to solve the differences diplomatically, not by military commandos but by foreign ministers. Indeed, the two foreign ministers of Britain. African history, Sudan 1855-1914. Thus, it can be concluded that France and Britain almost went to war at Fashoda in 1898 due to many forces, most important being the economic rivalry. Both France and Britain wanted to extend their economic imperialism in Africa in general and Sudan in particular. However, due to many forces, but most important the diplomatic understanding between the French and the British, the crisis did not erupt into open war. Causes of the Fashoda incident. Without River Nile waters, there is no life in Egypt. The desire for Britain to bring the whole of the Nile Valley states under her control led to Fashoda crisis. Fashoda had less economic prospect, but she was of great importance to European colonialists. It was part of the Nile, the control of which by other rival powers would affect life in Egypt by tampering with the flow of the Nile waters, hence polarizing the British interests. The pressure from other scrambling powers was another cause, like from Congo area. Leopold XI aimed at creating a big empire from Congo eastwards to Zanzibar without limiting its northern extent. This threatened the British and French, which caused a rush to go and occupy Sudan. There was also pressure from other European powers, especially Italy and Germany, that had just emerged out of unification and wanted colonies on the African continent. Furthermore, it is stated that Britain was trying to revenge for the death of Charles Gordon during the Mahdist Revolt and decided to reconquer Sudan in 1898. British public argued that Gordon was a martyr who had gone to Sudan on humanitarian mission and therefore needed revenge against Sudan by reconquering it, hence out-competing it from the hands of Frenchmen. On top of this, Britain had declared protectorate over Uganda in 1894 and Kenya also had been colonized in 1895. Britain was already in control of the source of the Nile, and the French advance to Sudan was considered a threat to their interests. The Franco-Congolese Agreement of 1894 was also responsible for Fashoda incident. By this agreement, France was to go ahead and occupy Bahr el Ghazal in the Upper Nile Valley. As a result of this agreement, Captain Merchant advanced expeditions to occupy the southern Sudan. This incident was a result of French disappointment upon losing Egypt. They wanted to compensate for the loss of Britain by taking control of Sudan, through which the Nile waters flow. Britain and France had for long been enemies alike. In 1882, Britain unnecessarily occupied Egypt in a complete disregard of the French interests in the Suez Canal and Egypt. African history, Sudan 1855-1914. During the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, Britain had supported Leopold's claims over Congo, leading to the formation of Congo Free State under Leopold XI, which culminated into the calling of Berlin Conference. Hence, by 1896, Fashoda incident had a number of accumulated facts of enmity between France and Britain. Britain had stood on the way of all French designs ever since the Napoleonic period. Since then, the sanctions of the continental system, Britain and France had mistrusted one another in the field of trade and politics. On the African continent, there were threats exerted to Ethiopia under Menelik XI after defeating Italians in 1896. After this year, Ethiopia became a threat to European colonizers, and worse still, Menelik XI openly stated his intentions to participate in the scramble of neighboring states like Sudan. Even years before this, relationship between Sudan and Ethiopia were not good, like in the Battle of Matma of 1889. Some scholars argue that this incident could have resulted from the ambitiousness of the two men, i.e. Captain Merchant and Lord Kitchener. This was because Frenchmen in Africa wanted to revenge for the loss of Egypt and reassert the French political glory in Africa. By 1890, Britain had begun a formal move to colonization of Africa. She was no longer interested in informal colonies. In South Africa, Cecil Rhodes had developed a plan to paint Africa red. From Cape Province to Cairo. The French advance to Sudan was therefore to block this plan. The consequences of the Fashoda crisis. In 1898, a stable government was established in Sudan and resistance in all quarters crushed. Confidence was restored by fixing low taxes, land reforms were carried out and titles of land were registered. Schools and communications were established, and by 1914, firm boundaries of Sudan with Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia and Zaire were agreed. At the end of the crisis, Sudan was declared a British colony. Both Britain and Egypt were to govern Sudan as their colony. This led to the rise of condominium government in Sudan until 1956. The condominium joined foreign governments in control of a state was an Anglo-Egyptian administration where the Queen of Britain and Khedive of Egypt jointly governed Sudan. The interests of Britain in Khartoum were looked after by Governor-General, assisted by many British governors. The first Governor-General was Sir Herbert Kitchener. He ruled Sudan until 1899, when he went to Africa on the outbreak of the Second Anglo-Boer War for enforcement. He was succeeded by Reginald Wingate. France lost Sudan to Britain, thus its dreams of extending its African bloc of territories to Somaliland flopped. African history, Sudan 1855-1914, were mainly Christians. It marked the beginning of conflicts between the southern Christians and northern Muslims. It contributed to the colonization of large parts of West Africa and French Somaliland by France. This was because in conclusion of this crisis, Captain Merchant and General Kitchener agreed to solve their differences diplomatically, where France left Sudan for Britain and Britain was to recognize French colonies in West Africa. It led to division of Congo into two parts. The Fashoda crisis led to the conflict between France and King Leopold 11 of Belgium, who had controlled Congo-Zaire in 1876. Having lost Sudan, France became more interested in taking of Congo and decided to compensate the King Leopold XI of Belgium. This struggle led to sharing of the Congo into two by France and King Leopold. King Leopold took over Congo-Kinshasa and the French took over Congo-Brazzaville. Loss of lives on the side of Sudan due to weak arms. They had carried muskets and spears to fight against. Cannon fire, Maxim guns, and repeater rifles. Many of the Sudanese Caliphate forces died at Kordofan. Indirect rule system was introduced in Sudan by Anglo-Egyptian government. Local chiefs were employed, but those received orders from above, where the top posts were dominated by British and Egyptians. In the army and civil service, the British were at the top, with the post of the Governor-General as the head of the army being held by a Briton throughout the condominium government. In social sector, Christianity was encouraged, health services put up, and the British type of education was introduced. Indeed, in 1902, Gordon Memorial School was established. It began as a primary school and had become a secondary school by 1905. While the French withdrew from Fashoda, African history ensued in 1855-1914. The Anglo-Egyptian force could easily get supplies from Egypt and from the British bases of the Mediterranean. On the other hand, the French expedition was completely cut off from France, which had the nearest bases in Senegal and French Somaliland. The French foreign minister was not a warmonger. He believed more in negotiations than war. He thought that negotiations with Britain would save France an embarrassment in Africa. France did not see a reason for fighting over miserable swamp island banks of Fashoda. After all, there was still plenty of territory in Africa which was considered to be better than the sandbank. The French government recognized the right of Great Britain and Egypt to rule Sudan. In return, Great Britain recognized the right of France to her West African claims, and with this, France saw no reason of fighting a dangerous war.